So the last time that we were here all the way back in 2019, we also had a talk about pricing optimization. And we opened that with a bit of a show of hands from the room. So we thought in that tradition, we'll do the same thing today. So a show of hands for anyone in the room who has looked at pricing optimization as one of your strategies. Wow, fantastic. That's great to hear. It looks like a lot of you have started to explore pricing optimizations, and maybe some of you are looking at it for the first time. So Daniel and I are lucky enough to work with many of you in the room, but developers of all shapes and sizes. And one thing that we constantly hear from them is that price optimizations is more than just changing the price. It's actually about trying to change the price and optimizing it to drive fair value and equity for your players. And I really love this quote from Miniclip. As Daniel and I will highlight today, good pricing strategy is actually about creating fair value for your players and opportunities for to flourish in the experiences that you put all of those efforts into. And hopefully some of you have either seen or maybe even used the localized pricing experiments tool, which Alex was talking about this morning, that we launched in the Play console in May this year. So we'll dive into this tool in a little bit more detail a bit later on. But we just wanted to share some high-level data with you to start. So across the 1,200 developers that have used the pricing tool to date, 350 of those experiments have been applied. And on average, we're seeing about a 65% uplift in spend of statistically significant and applied experiments. So through insights that we've garnered from this tool, as well as some of the developer conversations that we've heard from some of you in the room and beyond, really, what we think it boils down to is that changing price to local market nuances is really just the beginning. And as I've said already, it's more than just changing price. It's about optimizing it. So before we dive in, I just want to thank all of the developers in the room and beyond who have contributed either through the tool or through sharing some of their insights today. So thank you.
It's awesome. Thanks, Robbie. So let's start with a very popular purchasing power index that I'm sure all of you are very familiar with, the Big Mac Index, which tracks the prices of Big Macs globally, ranging from under $3 in price-sensitive countries like India, Indonesia, all the way to over $6 in countries like Norway and Switzerland. Now, when it comes to localized pricing, this is often a common starting point for some developers, but it might not be ideal since this particular index tracks a single product, the Big Mac, whereas your games will most likely have multiple products and price points. However, we do want you to focus on the general trend lines of this chart, specifically how prices are increasing along with the purchasing power of the country. Because when we take a look at internal Google Play data, specifically the average transaction values by country for the top games on Play, we actually see a very similar trend line like we see before with the Big Mac Index. So the ATVs range from $2 in Turkey and India, all the way to over $15 in Korea and Taiwan, which actually indicate that buyers on Google Play have different monetization behaviors by country. So this actually suggests a big opportunity and upside for developers that are localizing their prices by market. And we saw earlier that many of you are. So why is this all important? Compared to non-buyers, at the end of the day, we all want to give our users the best experience possible while also being able to increase our business metrics. And we can actually do this by using pricing as a tool to increase buyer conversion. So not only do more buyers equal a bigger top-line revenue versus non-buyers, obviously, but they also have higher engagement at over 3x the sessions and minutes per user, a higher retention through a larger committed user base, so think users that are engaging more and returning more often within the month, and a higher stickiness at over 2x the DAU over MAU when compared to non-buyers. So for example, Starberry Games, who are in the room today, they actually see a 3x difference increase in a day 30 retention for payers versus non-payers in their game Merge Mare. And they're actually looking into price optimizations to improve this metric even further. So now, despite all these upsides that we talk about, we know that there's still plenty of concerns and challenges that developers still face when it comes to pricing. So let's go through some of these today, shed some light on some strategies that you can kind of implement to mitigate some of these concerns, and also give you the confidence you need to start optimizing pricing today. All right, so one of the most common concerns we hear from developers is that changing pricing is too risky, and that doing so might negatively affect their top-line revenue. And this is definitely a valid concern. Changing pricing can affect revenue, both positively and negatively. However, there are many ways to ensure that you're not just changing pricing, but actually optimizing pricing. And we'll walk through some ways where you can minimize risks to eventually make these positive optimizations, even in your biggest markets. So one big way you can do this is through A/B testing. And as we mentioned earlier, the price experiments tool is now available for all developers. It makes it much, much easier to go in and price test your IAP products directly on the Play console as well. So A/B testing in general can help you minimize your risks. But even within the testing process, there are several variables that you can tweak depending on your risk preference. So the first variable is audience segmentation. So what % of your audience do you want to show these test prices to, and also in which countries? You can also adjust the actual product selection, meaning do you want to test pricing in all your SKUs in what we call blanket testing, or do you want to just start off with 1 or 2 SKUs? Another big way you can manage risk is through the actual price change percentage, meaning how deep of a price decrease or increase do you want to test? And then finally, the test duration. So how long do you want to be showing these test prices to your users? So depending on all the variables that you use as a combination, the duration until a test reaches statistical significance will actually vary. Now, for the more risk-averse developers in the room, you can minimize risks even further by exploring testing pricing in a different country with similar purchasing power and monetization in order to understand the impact that it would have on the markets you actually want to change. And we can actually do this by what we call country clusters. So to illustrate this point, take this chart that we saw earlier that shows the ATV for the top games on Play. What you can do is group these countries into country clusters with similar monetization and purchasing power. And we break them down into 5 different clusters here, ranging from low purchasing power all the way to high purchasing power. And the strategies for price optimizations will differ across each of them. So for example, countries in the low purchasing power will naturally be more sensitive to pricing, with a higher distribution of transactions coming from lower price points. So in this case, in this specific cluster, sub-dollar pricing can be an effective strategy in order to increase your first-time buyer conversion. On the other hand, countries in the high purchasing power cluster can have a bigger appetite for higher price points, assuming that the value for these SKUs are compelling enough. So as an example, let's say that Mexico is one of the most important markets for your game. In order to minimize your risks, you identify Chile as a great test market since it hits on all the following criteria. It's from the same country cluster as Mexico, so in this case, the low to mid purchasing power cluster. It carries less risk with a smaller impact to your game's overall revenue. It has similar monetization behavior as Mexico, so think metrics like ATV, median first purchase price, lifetime value, ARPU, etc. And then finally, it has enough active users for an efficient A/B test. So once you get these results, you can then either continue to fine-tune your test parameters and test even more, or actually go ahead and apply these price changes directly to Mexico or any other country in that same cluster. So as Simon, the co-founder of SpaceApe, highlights here, not only does adapting to local purchasing power help reach more players, it's also the ethically right thing to do. So while changing pricing can definitely add risk, you'll most likely come out on top for both your users and your business by optimizing pricing while minimizing risks.
Yeah, thank you, Daniel. So another common concern that we often hear from developers like you is around cannibalization, particularly in the context of discount or location-based pricing. And really, we think that understanding and being very vigilant of the potential impacts that cannibalization can cause to your game economy is really important. But again, approaching discounting or location-based pricing as an optimization rather than just a change can also have potentially some really positive impacts on your game economy. And what's more, we think that there are some pretty simple and cost-effective ways that you can introduce some strategies into your game to mitigate the risk of cannibalization and still optimize price and delight your local players. So let's just start by having a quick look at what cannibalization might mean to game developers like yourself. Maybe you offer a discount on a product, but the sales volumes don't actually increase, so essentially you're leaving money on the table. Maybe you introduce a lower price SKU that actually offsets the sales from a higher price SKU. Or maybe you offer discounts quite regularly and some of your player base are actually waiting or forcing discounts before they make a purchase, making distinct sales troughs. These are really valid concerns, but we think that with some creative strategies, as I said, you can actually turn the risks associated with cannibalization into upsides. So let's start by having a look at some of the very creative strategies that Supercell, who I think are also in the room today, have adopted to localize price and delight some of their emerging market players, while also having upsides for other parts of their game economy. So Supercell introduced sub-dollar pricing for the first time in Indonesia, really to appeal to the local needs of the audiences there. So they introduced SKUs at the US dollar equivalent of 35 cents and 60 cents. And not only were they actually able to increase the conversions on those optimized prices, on the sub-dollar prices, but it actually had a spillover effect into the rest of the game economy. So they also saw a really positive impact on some of their higher value items, notably the Golden Pass. So, like Supercell, let's take a look at some of the strategies that you might employ to turn the fear of cannibalization into an opportunity for your games. First and foremost, start simple and test interchangeable SKUs together. If you think of optimizations across SKU families, so for example, gems, and really nail how you're optimizing that, then you can slowly progress to more complicated combinations like bundles. Secondly, you've probably heard this a million times today, but test, test, and test again. Don't make any changes to your game economy without really fully understanding the potential knock-on impact that it would have. Thirdly, remember that pricing optimization is more than just about looking at your existing SKUs. Actually, introducing new SKUs or new offers can sometimes deter and offset the impacts of cannibalization as well. And finally, rely on the expertise of your UX team to really employ smart design in your shopfront to anchor or pivot users to certain higher value offers that you want them to transact on. But one area of cannibalization that we do have to address, because we do hear it quite often from developers, is the fear that players might game the system and actually country hop to take advantage of some of the location-based pricing offers that you're offering in those countries. Firstly, we just want to put you at ease a little bit here. It's far less prevalent than many developers may think. And what's more, there's actually some pretty robust Google Play billing policy that ensures that these players are actually legitimate country hoppers. So firstly, a player is only able to move country once every 12 months. And also, they need to have a local form of payment enabled in the country that they're moving to before they can make the change. So we actually think that the risk is a little bit less prevalent than we hear from some developers. And we think that combined with this really robust Google Play billing policy, as well as some of these creative and simple strategies that we talked about earlier, you can turn the fear of cannibals in your game economy into an opportunity to delight and meet the unique needs of your player base.
Thanks, Robbie. So this actually leads us to our third concern. And as seasoned developers, you all already know that one price does not fit all. Now, we already talked about pricing by markets, but one thing that's often overlooked is that strategic pricing not only refers to pricing across markets, but also across the different segmentation of buyers as well. Simply broken down into new buyers and repeat buyers. So let's revisit this chart that we saw earlier twice that shows the average transaction values for the top games on Play. Now layer in the first purchase price, here in orange, which represents the transaction value for new buyers, whereas the green represents the transaction value for repeat buyers. Now there's a lot of interesting insights that we can take away from this chart, but we'll distill 3 key takeaways today. So number 1, we can see here the purchasing power effect that we saw before across all countries. So this time, not just across the average transaction value, but also across the first purchase price as well. Again, this shows us that users in each country have different pricing sensitivities when it comes to buyer conversion. Number 2, you can see here that the price points for new buyers is lower than repeat buyers, across all countries. This tells us that while pricing is an important factor for both new and repeat buyers, it's an even bigger motivator for new buyers. So we'll pause here for a second to think about what you can do in order to increase first-time buyer conversion. So think about some of your most popular SKUs in your game that offer the most value. So these things could be starter packs, battle passes, which typically ranges in the $5 to $10 range, which could be considered a bit expensive compared to the first purchase price metric that we just saw, which ranges from under $1 to $5. So in order to increase first-time buyer conversion, could you consider lower price points in that same range? So for example, maybe you can introduce a new basic tier battle pass at a lower cost that might have less contents overall, but still provides the same value multiple as your existing battle pass, so tiered battle passing. So when accounting for the best practices around deterring cannibalization that Robbie just walked through, you'll be able to make your offers much more accessible to all of your players. The point is, once you're able to convert your players into buyers, it then opens up the door for repeat purchases, typically at a much higher price point. And then finally, number 3, I want you to focus on the gap between the transaction values of new buyers and repeat buyers, and see how this difference generally increases the higher the country's purchasing power becomes. Now, this tells us that there are different strategies in play depending on the market. So for example, while there's an opportunity to convert a repeat buyer at a much higher price point versus a new buyer in Japan, this is actually not the case for countries with lower purchasing power. So take Brazil, for example, where you can see that $1 or a 2x difference between the first purchase price and the average transaction value, compared to roughly $10 or a 3x difference in Japan. So to recap, not only can you think about pricing by markets, but it's also very, very important to consider pricing across the different segmentation of buyers. In this case, new buyers and repeat buyers.
But actually understanding and being aware of the nuances of first-time and repeat buyers is just part of the challenge. Many developers that we talk to also worry that pricing optimization, particularly location-based pricing optimizations, may be perceived as discriminatory or unfair to players in other markets. But as Daniel said, if we factor in purchasing power, the opposite can be said to be true. And actually, if we're applying a price as a blanket across all of the player base that we're talking about, we could be actually pricing players out of the games that you make. And as we've said, we think that there are many strategies that can be employed to think about, instead of price discrimination, how can you create price equity? So let's flip the language a little bit here and talk about this in terms of price equity rather than price discrimination. And let's dive a little bit deeper into just one of the ways that you can think about driving that price equity in your game economy, which is location-based pricing optimizations. So in today's macroeconomic climate, with increased competition and market saturation, as well as some of the pressures that I'm sure you're feeling around UA, we think that location-based pricing to drive equity is more interesting and important than ever. What's more, we think that there are ways that you can explore location-based pricing optimizations while still maintaining positive player sentiment across the geos that you're operating in. So imagine if after our presentation today, you go back to your studios and you decide that India is a strategic market for growth. Now, the simplest optimization that you could make is to either increase the value, so you pay the same amount, but you get more bang for your buck, or to decrease the price, so the same value, but at a cheaper price. This is fine, but what we've really seen here is that while buyers may increase, which is great, as Daniel's already referred to, revenue generally remains static, and what's worse, in worst-case scenarios, you might even have negative player sentiment in some of your core geos, which obviously is something you don't want. So if we get a little bit more creative, how could we think about driving purchases in India while still maintaining that positive player sentiment in one of our core markets like the US? So after you do some analysis, you think that sub-dollar pricing might be a really good way to drive more buyers from your Indian audience. So you lower the price drastically for one of your soft currencies, let's say in this situation, gems. And maybe that discount that you've offered is actually offset by an increase in ad impressions. But at the same time, you increase the price of one of your higher value SKUs that's more targeted towards the whales in your economy. Or maybe you take advantage of some of India's many local customs and festivals and traditions and decide to offer a Holi-themed chest available only in India to Indian players. This would delight your local users in your Indian market, but players in the US might not have their sentiment deteriorate because the offer wouldn't be as appealing to those players. Or alternatively, maybe you tweak some of your spend thresholds that players have to meet in order to get a reward. So in the US, you offer buy 5 chests and get 1 free, but in India, you lower it to buy 3 chests and get 1 free. The point is, we think with some creativity, courage, and as I've said, a lot of testing, you can make changes to your game economy and to your price optimization using player location to drive those decisions without impacting the player sentiment in your core markets. And importantly, you can turn any perceptions of price discrimination into opportunities to showcase price equity. So hopefully we've addressed some of your concerns around pricing and really given you some takeaways to either start your journey into pricing optimization or maybe continue it. We started by talking about some of the risks that are associated with pricing optimizations, pricing changes, but to think of it more as an opportunity to optimize rather than just change price. And we talked about ways that you can test using A/B testing and thinking about countries in terms of clusters in order to build confidence. We also talked about price cannibalization and ways that you can mitigate price cannibalization, whether it be through starting small and then expanding and scaling your testing, or through using UX and pricing psychology in your shop front. And finally, we talked about the concern that one price fits all. By thinking about players not only about, by thinking about our players and opportunities to optimize price, not only in terms of their location, but also in terms of whether they're new or repeat buyers.
All right, so before we go, we want to leave you with a quote from Matthias, the CEO of Saibo, and the team behind the very successful game Subway Surfers. And he highlights the importance of creating experiences for all players that reflect global differences, including with monetization. Now, you've heard from us and our featured partners why pricing is important, and we covered some AIs to hopefully give you the confidence you need to alleviate some of these top concerns around pricing. But if there's one thing that we want you to take away from this talk, it would be this. So while price optimization is the core of strategic pricing, we'd like you to think of it more as price equity, so that all your users around the world are able to enjoy the full experience of the magic you all create, regardless of where they're from. Thank you.